As well, we're getting in some breaking inputs right now because Iran is claiming massive missile and drone attack on US airbase in Bahrain. Iran has claimed that it has destroyed the main command headquarters at the US base in Bahrain. This is some big breaking news, in fact, coming in. Smoke actually seen rising from this US base in Bahrain, as you can see on the screen as well. This is the US base in Bahrain that has now been attacked by Iran. Could this have in fact been a result of some miscalculations by the United States? That's a question that's now coming to mind as well. But Iran so far is claiming that there was a massive missile and drone attack over here, and this in fact is on a US airbase in Bahrain.
Dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers, welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I am here as always with my co-host Seamus Malek-Afzeli, along with our producer, M. Siniza. We are recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying, but so far from dead.
We've spoken a lot on this show already about the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, but a state that has not gotten the attention it deserves from us just yet has been the state nestled just off the coast of Kuwait, near to the Saudis and the Qataris, the Kingdom of Bahrain.
Bahrain in Arabic means two seas, a fitting name for the tiny archipelago state whose only connecting point to the Arabian Peninsula is the King Fahd Causeway, a bridge linking it to Saudi Arabia. Bahrain has been under the rule of one family, the Al Khalifas, for 2 centuries. For about 100 of those years, from the 1870s to the 1970s, it was formerly a colony of the British, who supported the monarchy and used the island nation as a military outpost in the Gulf. Though they gained formal independence in 1971, the country was soon incorporated under the US security umbrella in the region.
Bahrain bore the brunt of Iran's military retaliation against the United States and Israel, with Iranian drones and missiles raining down on hotels housing American soldiers and U.S. military bases that littered the island, including the headquarters of the all-important Fifth Fleet of the U.S. Navy.
And by hosting the headquarters of that all-important Fifth Fleet, Bahrain plays an outsized role in the U.S.'s power projection in the region. And indeed, the US has launched many of its attacks on Iran from Bahraini soil. But as we've seen in the recent war, that has come with a heavy price. US and Israeli adventurism has drawn retaliatory fire that has destabilized the country, although perhaps not in the way that you might imagine. Instead of producing a rally around the flag effect, the Iranian counterstrikes have sparked opposition to the ruling monarchy, and even some amount of support for the Iranian war effort, which has in turn led to heavy repressive crackdowns.
This opposition was, of course, not, as the Bahraini government would like people to believe, an invention of an IRGC PSYOP or some other form of conniving Iranian influence. Back in 2011, an uprising against the ruling monarchy in Bahrain swept the country. Though primarily backed by the Shia opposition, joining forces with Sunni opponents of the government was not enough to bring down the state, as Saudi forces entered the country to help put down the uprising. The hope of that uprising was for the Bahraini government to fulfill the promises it had made for better democratic representation to the people 10 years prior. Now, Bahrain has languished under greater and greater restrictions, the idea of representative democracy seeming further and further away, despite the appearance of a constitutional system complete with a council of representatives and regular elections for that body.
We get into the 2011 uprising in the conversation that follows. And one thing from our conversation that I found really interesting is this dynamic that emerges where protesters take the streets, start to organize themselves with initially demands that are actually quite moderate. I had a moment in our interview where I asked our guest about the uprising, and I actually misstated something. I said that the initial demands of the protest movement were for the complete overthrow of the ruling family. And he corrected me to say that actually those were not the initial demands, and that those demands only came after the repression of the state and the monarchy of those organizers and those protesters. And I find that really interesting because it's actually something that I observe in my own work in defense of the student movement, where a lot of the times students organize themselves around demands against their institution that are relatively benign. They want to change some policy to accord with their understanding of justice or human rights and some amount of complicity with US militarism, with genocide abroad, etc. And they're met with such repressive crackdown from their administrations that they start to harden themselves and they start to radicalize in their tactics. And that's really interesting to me. I think it's really important because a lot of times I think people see others making radical demands or taking radical action or using radical tactics and think that this comes from some ideological origin point, right? Like they just happen to, have radical ideas. But really, I think resistance and the willingness to sacrifice comes from the experience of being up against power. And that was a really important lesson I think I took away from this conversation.
I also thought about the other experiences, during the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring, in which a lot of governments took the kind of direction that Bahrain also took, in that they resist all demands for any kind of reforms, and they inevitably find themselves with an uprising at their doorstep, which they may or may not have to violently put down and extinguish. Whereas the stories of not only Arab states, but Arab monarchies, which did listen to those reformist demands, go and those stories are not talked about in regards to the Arab Spring because they are somewhat of success stories. In Oman's example, some protesters come, demand more powers for the elected advisory body to the Sultan, and the Sultan, understanding where the winds are blowing, doesn't want to stir up things in a country that is very stable, accedes to those reforms, and then people go home. But that kind of monarchical approach is not shared by any other state in that region. Oman is kind of one of a kind in this regard. And what Bahrain has done kind of sealed its fate in terms of any kind of representation for the majority of its people.
Yeah, I really learned a lot from zooming in on what is a very small state that, I was aware of from that uprising in 2011 and the Al Jazeera documentary that we talk about in this episode. I really encourage people to go out and watch Shouting in the Dark, which covers that period and some of the dynamics. But I think you can learn a lot from looking really closely at some of these smaller states and how they are navigating the larger impasse that we find ourselves in the region and more globally. So to get into all of that, we had on today the independent writer and researcher that we will refer only to as Aamer, which is his first name. And we cover the history of Bahrain, including the history of the left in Bahrain. We talk about the 2011 uprising and its aftermath. And of course, we get into the current conditions and dynamics in the country, and in particular, how it's navigating a gulf that is more fractured than ever amidst the current crisis.
Before we get into the conversation, we do have a pitch to you, the listener. Turbulence is entirely listener-funded. We don't run ads. We don't take money from institutions. And that independence is the foundation of this project. It only exists because of you.
Because we're committed to providing you the in-depth history and present context you need to make sense of each of these topics, these episodes take a great deal of time and effort to produce, from conception to research to editing. It's because we value your time as a listener, and because we want to produce something lasting and useful, that we think this level of effort is worth investing in. But that means we can't quite move as nimbly as we might otherwise like. So in addition to our free public episodes, we're also dropping weekly episodes behind the paywall. That's where we'll be able to respond to events as they unfold in closer to real time, providing our analysis, following up on threads and conversations from prior episodes, and drawing connections across the topics we've covered.
To do all this, we need your support. A $5 monthly subscription will give you access to the bonus feed, our Substack community, and most importantly, you'll make it possible for us to keep doing this work independently week after week. Subscribe today at turbulencepod.substack.com and follow along on Twitter and Instagram at turbulence_pod. We hope you'll join us. We are speaking here today with Aamer. He is a writer and researcher from Bahrain, and he joins us now. Aamer, thanks for being on.
Thanks for having me, guys.
I wanted to start out by asking you about this notion of revoking citizenship as a form of criminal punishment, something that really does not seem to exist in any major way as a form of punishment outside of Gulf Arab states. I mean, of course, there's a push here in the United States to revoke citizenship of immigrants and people of further political opinions. But the way that Kuwait and, of course, Bahrain have been revoking citizenship from people for, I mean, not even just sympathizing with Iran, but just for reposting images, has been very bewildering and terrifying to me. I mean, I have here some quotes from recent news coverage of this. Quote, on April 27th, the king issued an extraordinary decree to revoke the citizenship of 69 Bahrainis for sympathizing with hostile Iranian acts without due process. On April 28th, the criminal court gave 5 people life sentences for espionage, while dozens more were given 5 to 10 years in prison for uploading videos of attacks. Bahraini influencer Syed Bakr al-Kamil was given 10 years for posting an Instagram reel mourning the death of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. And here's another one here. This is more recent. Quote, early in the morning on May 9th, authorities arrested 41 of the country's top Shia religious figures for allegedly conspiring with the IRGC, shocking the Native majority. The Ministry of Interior blamed one of the tenets of Shia Islamism, the Walayat al-Faqih, for the alleged acts of terrorism, unquote. So why is making someone stateless seemingly the first line of attack for Bahrain and other Gulf states?
I mean, there's the social contract element of it, which is that the understanding or the conception of citizenship in Bahrain is, and the Gulf at large, is fundamentally different from other parts of the world, where citizenship is seen not as a right, but as a privilege, and it's a privilege granted to you by the monarchy. And it's a privilege that can be maintained with sufficient loyalty and support of said monarchy. And if that threshold is no longer met, then they reserve the right to withdraw it. And withdrawing citizenship is very, very torturous because, first of all, several points. One, when they do these things where they strip you of citizenship, they don't just strip you of citizenship, they strip all of your children and your wife too. So it's a family thing. So the 69 people you mentioned, that's like including the children of people who were guilty of crimes, and I'm putting crimes in air quotes here. And when they strip you of citizenship, that means that you can't access education, you can't access healthcare, you can't access government jobs, the pension. You're basically made into like a non-person. Kuwait is notorious for this. They have like some 200,000 stateless people, the Bidoon, and that's a whole other conversation. But Bahrain has been doing this since 2011, since the uprising 2011. I mean, they've been doing it before, but it's escalated since 2011. And some of the people that you mentioned that they've stripped citizenship, they've also deported to Iran now. But they're stateless. So like they're stateless and they're in Iran, a country that they've never been to, that they don't speak the language of. So, good luck with that. The methods by which they apply it is legal in the context of Bahrain because they've developed this assembly line process where they'll arrest you, they'll put you in front of a kangaroo court, and all the papers, the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and they'll just strip you of citizenship. And the other aspect of it that's so bad is that once you're stripped of citizenship, it makes applying for refugee status elsewhere also almost impossible because you need citizenship, you need papers to like reach out to most international organizations. And once you're stateless, that process itself becomes a lot more difficult. And again, it goes back to the Khalifas and the Sabahs and all of these royal families. They view citizenship as something they grant you, not something that you're entitled to.
Wow. Is that codified anywhere? So the process of being stripped of citizenship, or like, I'm just curious, you're saying some of the people remain in the country as a dispossessed, stateless, internal population. Some people are deported to Iran, which is insane.
This is new. The deportation to Iran is new. They've done it previously to Shia clerics, like leaders and opposition leaders, but this to random families is relatively new.
And is that, on your view, is that part of the broader propaganda push to associate any kind of internal opposition as external influence? The implication being that these people are not actually authentic Bahraini citizens, they are being sent by Iran or something? Or is it just a kind of sadistic form of punishment?
Both. I mean, the argument the monarchy always made was all opposition to it is foreign funded, specifically from Iran. And that's an argument they're holding now. And the flip side of the stripping people of citizenship is now they've been forcing people. Well, I say forcing, but you really never know who's a loyalist and who's doing it out of fear and who's doing it out of opportunism. But people are signing pledges to the king, the person of the king, not the national abstraction as such. And it started with broad families and clans, and it's now devolved to individuals and their wives and kids. And they're publishing lists of people that are pledging allegiance weekly. And the longer this goes, the more the people whose name is not on the list are standing out more and more. So you're either with us or you're with Iran. That's the logic they're trying to present. If you're in the opposition, you're by definition with Iran. That's the government's line. You're a fifth column, you're a traitor, etc., etc. And if you're not in opposition, then why aren't you signing the Pledge of Allegiance? Do you not like our king? What's the problem there, eh?
In preparing for this interview, I rewatched the Al Jazeera documentary on the 2011 uprising, Shouting in the Dark, which is really an excellent documentary. And one of the things that they covered was, in the aftermath of the uprising, state TV calling individual people that had reportedly been at Pearl Roundabout and asking them if they denounced their activities, or picking out famous football players, etc.
Yep.
Is that kind of public naming and shaming, or kind of inverse naming and shaming by demanding these public pledges? Is that something that started after the uprising in 2011? Is it a more of a modern tool of repression?
Yeah, it was a post-2011 phenomenon, and it's just escalated. And they do the two sides of it, which is they'll name and shame the people that they deem enemies of the state. And then they'll get on loyalists on TV, random citizens who are I love the king and I think these people should be deported and denaturalized and get them out of here. They're all traitors. And it's very deliberate. They will send state media journalists, and I'm putting again journalists in quotes here, to diwaniyas, where guys gather. I don't know how to describe it in English. It's a big living room, and men of a certain family would gather, or to malls, for example, and they'll just interview random people and be so what do you think of this stripping of citizenship? And the idea that you're supposed to say, I support it and I think these people are traitors or whatever. So you have to affirm your loyalty publicly, and if you're a member of the opposition and you get called into state TV, you have to affirm that you regret all of this, and it is what you said earlier. It's sadistic torture by public humiliation. It's a very medieval form of affirming one's loyalty to the king, essentially.
Do you get the sense that there is a domestic constituency for this, or is this purely...
Oh, yeah.
There is.
Yes, there are loyalists who are monarchists, fully believe in the Khalifa, fully believe in this idea of the king, the royal family. A lot of them, obviously, they get material benefits from believing this, but ideologically, they're also committed to this. It's mostly Sunni Arab families that live in Rafah, and some elsewhere, but they're the ones who have the highest ministerial positions. They're the ones who have some of the best positions in Babco and Elba.
Babco being the state
oil company, and Alba is the state aluminum company. That's the other thing. Bahrain's economy is oil and aluminum. And they get good jobs and good benefits and good opportunities, but they're also ideologically committed to this. And they're the ones who, during 2011, there was the Fidaiya, which are basically paramilitary thugs who would go around beating people up. They attacked students who they deemed were Shia anti-government people. During 2011, they attacked them in the University of Bahrain. There was a big scuffle. The government knows its base, and it knows how to mobilize them very well.
Yeah, so I think we'll definitely want to come back to 2011 and its origins and its impacts, etc. But I do want to come to the current war. And starting from the very first days of the war, Bahrain has taken pretty extremely heavy reprisals from Iran, which retaliated against the US-Israeli assault by targeting US bases and assets in the region. And one of their main targets has been the Fifth Fleet of the US Navy, which is headquartered in Bahrain.
Yes.
And in the piece that you co-wrote, you write that this base was inherited from the British, who established it in the 19th century. I'm curious about this base and how the US military presence in the country more broadly was perceived in the country before the war. More precisely, is the US military presence in the country viewed as a form of inclusion under the US security umbrella? Like, in other words, as a protection from external threats? Or is it more viewed as a mechanism for the monarchy to retain the support of the United States? And then I'm curious if you think those perceptions have shifted over the course of the war.
From the state side, from the monarchy side, they view the base as essential to the security of the monarchy from both Iran and from domestic threats. From the public, the vast majority of the public, the base is very much hated and despised, which is why you saw the videos of the people cheering when the missiles were striking the base. But for the Bahraini monarchy in particular, they've always been far more committed to first the British and now the American security umbrella than even other Gulf states. Their foreign policy was always much less imaginative than, say, Qatar or Saudi even, who, because of their size, were much more adaptive and much more able to navigate the region. Whereas Bahrain, for both ideological reasons, being extremely hostile to Iran and for just sheer limits of geography and size, they had to commit to a protector. And politics of protection is something that is a fundamental cornerstone of Bahrain, right? Because it's such a small country, because there's not really a lot of room for foreign policy sovereignty, Bahrain has always felt that it had to have a security partner or a guarantor of some kind. And for a long time, that was the British, as you mentioned. And more recently, it's America, but more so through America's regional manager, Saudi, right? And that's until very recently. Now they've shifted towards the UAE, and that's developed a whole other thing that we can get into, the whole UAE-Saudi split and where Bahrain stands there. But the interesting aspect is that when the British were around, they protected the Khalifas and secured their rule. But at the same time, they worked to curb the worst excesses of Khalifa abuse towards the local population. And it was purely pragmatic, right? They didn't want uprisings. But when that shift turned from the British to the Americans, and in particular, the offloading of that to Saudi, there was much more leeway for the Khalifas to go back to the stick, right? Less carrot, more stick, or all stick, really. That's because Bahrain felt it no longer had to answer to the British anymore. It had to answer only to Saudi and then America, but America was much more hands-off. The base's presence is a way for Bahrain to hold America hostage in that sense. And that didn't change. They haven't withdrawn from the American security umbrella the way the Saudis and Qataris in particular are reevaluating their relationship with America. For Bahrain, and Bahrain has always been like this. It's I don't know. Personally, I think it's very stupid. When the British left, the former emir of Bahrain, the father of the current king, once told Queen Elizabeth, "Why did you leave? No one asked you to leave." That's how committed they are to this protection relationship. And that's the same attitude right now with America. There's no reevaluation. There's no evolution. There's just doubling down and tripling down.
I think it would be maybe helpful for folks to just explain, for people who don't know the geography of Bahrain, we're talking about it as a small country. Can you just describe a bit its geography and where it is?
It's a very small island off the coast of Saudi. It's connected to Saudi by one causeway, the King Fahd Bridge. It's a population of 1.5 million. It's a collection of islands. The total landmass is roughly the size of Rhode Island. It's very, very small. Even of that landmass, half of it is like the south, which is unpopulated. It's military land, and Skhir, which is desert. So it's very dense, the northern part. Of the 1.5 million, no one really knows because no one does censuses anymore back there because censuses are a very sensitive topic. But for a long time, the vast majority were Shia of the citizenry. But the expansion of both expat and migrant communities, as well as the political naturalization of Sunni Arabs elsewhere as a demographic manipulation, has made it such that no one really knows the proportions anymore. anymore. As far as I'm aware, it's majority Shia by a little bit, but not as much as it used to be. The island itself is between Saudiya and Qatar, though it's closer to Saudiya than Qatar. It's our old nationalist textbooks used to say it's located in a strategic place in the middle of the Arab Gulf. So that was always the thing we were told to repeat. And it is. It's a very strategic location for the Navy, but its economy also is very weak compared to the rest of the Gulf. It's always been in fiscal trouble for the last 20, 25 years. People think of the Gulf, they think oil, right? Bahrain's only oil comes from an offshore oil field shared with Saudiya. And Saudiya gives us the grace to use the oil and refine it, but it's purely a patron-client relationship. The other big thing is, like I said, aluminum. And we have a big aluminum refinery that is the second or the third largest in the world outside of China. So that's the other economic engine. A lot of sovereign debt. And the relationship with the other Gulf countries, insofar as Bahrain basically bounces between Saudiya and the UAE asking for money and handouts.
Yeah.
And that's just to keep everything afloat.
I find it kind of endearing in a really morbid and macabre way that all of this stuff with Lebanon, with the census and refusing to admit that Shias or Muslims in general might be the majority, that's happening at this extremely small scale. I am curious, I'm wondering if you could maybe expand more about this UAE-Saudi intra-Gulf split and where Bahrain falls on that. Because I know things are fluid right now, but the UAE seems to be on a very particular path, and Saudi Arabia seems to be on a very particular path, both very much accelerated by the war against Iran. And considering that previous alignment with the UAE, which you're talking about, how much they've been hit during this war, how much they're still cracking down on the opposition now. But amidst all this, even as they claim again and again that their army is ready for all scenarios on Twitter, when Mohammed bin Zayed, the leader of the Emiratis, came knocking at Bahrain's door to help build a coalition to retaliate against Iran, the Bahrainis also said no, along with everyone else.
That surprised me because I thought of all of the countries that would agree to this, it would be Bahrain. Because if you remember when Operation, whatever it's called, Amazon Prime, the block,
Prosperity Guardian?
That's the one, yes.
Yeah.
But when the Americans tried to gather some people to break the blockade of Bab al-Mandeb that Ansarullah had upheld, there was only one Gulf country that participated, and it was Bahrain. And they actually sent fighter jets, as a show of support and everything. So that shows you how committed Bahrain is to the American security umbrella there. With regards to the UAE and Saudiya split, that surprised me because I thought they would go in. The Saudiya-UAE split in of itself has a long history, going back to like 2016, 2017, during the height of the Yemen war, where Saudiya was caught in a quagmire, and bin Salman, the leader of Saudiya, blamed bin Zayed, the leader of the UAE, for dragging him into this. And since then, there was a lot of other arguments, OPEC being one. Saudiya was always trying to control the production of OPEC, like the quotas, keeping them limited, because they need oil to be much higher priced for their budgets, whereas the UAE is much more comfortable flooding the market. They don't care. And there was a lot of arguments back and forth to the point where UAE recently announced it was going to quit OPEC. The other thing was that Saudiya and the UAE are on different sides in the war in Sudan, in Libya, to a certain extent in Syria as well. And the UAE's foreign policy of this rash adventurism and the fracturing of states, Saudiya sees as they're uncomfortable with that because they've realized it's made the region a lot more difficult for them to manage. And even Yemen, they're on opposite sides in Yemen as well. And where Bahrain stands in all of this is that for a long time, Saudiya was Bahrain's main security guarantor. This was most clearly demonstrated in 2011 when Saudiya sent in troops to crush the uprising. There were UAE troops, but the majority of the troops of the Peninsula Shield, the Gulf Cooperation Council's security force, it used to be called the Peninsula Shield, now it's just called the Security Force. They sent the troops, and most of them were Saudi troops. That was back when our prime minister, deceased now, the king's uncle, and then King Abdullah were very close with one another. And they were both hardline anti-Iran hawks. The shift happened in the 2020s when the current crown prince and prime minister shifted towards the UAE in terms of foreign policy and fiscal policy as well. On a fiscal level, he's much more of a Thatcherite. The previous administration in Bahrain had a much more rentier state element to it, but like through parceling out fiefdoms through the ministries to different loyal families, and that's how you would get material wealth and access to resources. Whereas the current crown prince is far more of a McKinsey-type Thatcherite, cut state funding, cut state subsidies. And in this, he found an ally in the UAE. And on a security level, the shift towards the UAE meant that the Saudis they haven't washed their hands of Bahrain, and to an extent they never will. If push comes to shove, Saudi will always intervene to keep the Khalifas in power. But they haven't been as interested in the minutiae of domestic unrest, whereas the UAE has sent some advisors to Bahrain recently during this most recent war with Iran to keep the Khalifas happy and to keep the Bahraini government afloat. Not that there was any risk, by the way. My thesis is that since 2011, the opposition has been shattered and there's not really any organized opposition to the government at all.
Yeah, so I think we should talk about 2011 then, because it's come up a couple of times. And, really from the US perspective, the uprising in Bahrain was one of the untold stories of the so-called Arab Spring. I think the popular uprisings that toppled governments in Tunisia and Egypt got a lot of attention, as did the uprisings that turned into protracted civil wars or opportunities for foreign intervention like Syria and Libya. But there was a mass uprising in Bahrain that had mobilized a huge segment of the population, and not just Shia, but both Shia and Sunni, calling for the overthrow of the Al Khalifa ruling family. Can you talk about the significance of that uprising, maybe some of the kind of precursors or causes to it? And you just mentioned that you kind of think that the opposition has been shattered, but I'm curious if you think at all that the revolutionary forces there that gathered could potentially ever reemerge in the future.
Okay, before I start, I just want to correct one thing. Regarding 2011, the initial demands weren't the overthrow of the Khalifa. That came later after the crackdown. The initial demands were far more modest. It was the demand for the reform that was promised in 2001 and the establishment of a constitutional monarchy with real power for parliament and so forth. So initially, most people were okay with the monarchy as a symbolic head of state. The more extreme demands were a function of the crackdown. Now, going back to what precipitated 2011, when the current king came to power, when his father passed away in 1999, he instituted a series of reforms. Chief among them was a mass pardon of various opposition figures that were in exile or in prison during the 70s, 80s, and 90s during the various uprisings there. And these were both leftists and Islamists, by the way. Bahrain has a long history of leftist opposition parties, both Maoists, Orthodox communists, and like social democrats. And this mass pardon was a way to reinitiate the current king's program, which was documented in the 2001 referendum, which was passed by like 99%. And it was an interesting bait and switch where a lot of reforms were promised in this referendum. And in exchange, the country went from being a state with an emir as its leader to a monarchy, a king. So before that, the head of state was an emir. Now it was a king, and it was a hereditary monarchy. And once he got the referendum passed and he became a king, a lot of the reforms that were promised were watered down, including the powers of parliament, the powers to veto certain bills, to veto the prime minister. The opposition parties at that time were debating whether they should abstain from the elections or to run in the elections. That some of them ended up running and some of them won, but not enough to form a majority. And there was a lot of gerrymandering. There's a whole thing there. But during the 2000s, there was this period of, I would say, somewhat robust political activity out in the open. And to the extent that there was censorship and repression, it was more limited than what would come after. The explosion in 2011 happened because the frustration over the last decade since 2001, we weren't going anywhere. It was this impotency. And February 14, 2011, which is when the rally that started the rally in the Pearl Roundabout happened, was chosen because it was the 10th anniversary of the referendum in 2001. And I mean, obviously, the term Arab Spring is loaded. I don't like to use it. But obviously, there was some inspiration from what was happening in Tunisia and Egypt. But the demands were more modest initially, like I said. It was a constitutional monarchy, just follow up on the reforms from 2001, the empowerment of parliament. At that point, the rallies were led by the opposition parties, which were organized parties that had existed for decades at this point. Wifaq, which was the center-right Shia party, and Wa'd, which is the center-left, formerly, it's a legacy of the leftist movements of the 90s and 2000s, and some other parties as well. But the the crackdown that followed, the initial crackdown, and then the withdrawal of the troops to allow people to go back to the roundabout, hardened people's sentiments. That's when you started hearing Yasqut Yasqut Hamad, which is down with Hamad. And you also hear chants, by the way, like you said, it was a cross-section of society. It wasn't just Shia. It was Sunnis and Shias, leftists, secular, nationalists, Islamists. There was a whole assemblage of Bahrainis. And initially the chants were, "Ihna Khwan Sunna wa Shia hada al-watan man bi'a." We are brothers Sunni and Shia, this country we will not sell. And this shift after the crackdown to Yasqut Hamad and the demand for a downfall of the monarchy as such also precipitated the monarchy to crack down even harder, because they could then point and say, these people want the downfall of the monarchy, they're radicals, they're Islamist Shia, they want to do Wilayat al-Faqih here, which is not entire. Like, there is some people who sympathize with the Wilayat al-Faqih as a structure, not to be annexed to Iran specifically. I need to make that very clear. The government accuses these people of wanting Iran to annex Bahrain. Most people in the protests in 2011 were waving Bahraini flags, which is very ironic because the counter protesters who were supporting the monarchy were waving Bahraini and Saudi flags. Wow. So yeah, it's kind of how you see those Pahlavi protesters waving Israeli flags, and you're like, interesting choice of nationalism there. It's the same. It was really the same. Like, it was very ironic because the Bahraini protesters were very nationalistic. They had a vision of what Bahrain was, but it was fundamentally one of sovereignty and independence. Some of the big concerns besides the reforms of 2001 were political naturalization and access to state resources. So obviously the Shia believe that they've been dispossessed, which is true. There was also the belief, again, which was affirmed through the Bendergate scandal and then the BICI report after 2011, that the Bahraini government undertook a mass program of naturalizing Sunnis from Jordan, Palestine, Yemen, Syria, and Pakistan. And then not only naturalizing them, but they get access to jobs that are forbidden to Shia. So like police, the military, the state security apparatus. And those were the demands in 2011. Stop doing that. Let us get hired in the military and police and elsewhere and give parliament some power. But after the crackdown, that's when things got a lot more radical on both sides and feelings hardened. And at the same time, the shattering of the opposition was done where you had mass arrests, exile, and denaturalization. So most of the top opposition leaders from that period are still in jail. Those that are not in jail have, the political parties have been banned. Wifaq is banned, Wa'ad is banned. All of these political parties have been banned. Assembly, the right to assembly has been more or less curtailed. And when they do have rallies, they're very strictly surveilled and strictly controlled. Now, there are still protests, and there have been since 2011 on and off protests in the Shia villages, but these villages have been effectively cut off from one another through both deployment of police and the architecture of the country. So like building these massive highways that just curtail around these villages and then having them isolated such that the police can sort of just surround them and cut them off. And the protests could happen inside the village, but they don't come out, right? And that limitation has meant that without leaders, without the ability to mobilize mass politics, there is no opposition that is organized in the country anymore.
Yeah, there's a lot there that you mentioned that I would want to dig into, in particular, the history of left movements in the party and their relationship to Islamism. And I hope we can talk about that. But there's one very specific piece that I wanted to follow up on. You mentioned this in the really excellent piece that you co-authored for North-South Notes about that precise moment of crackdown when Saudi comes in kind of at the request of the Bahraini monarchy and kind of on behalf of the GCC to repress the protesters. And you mentioned that there is some suspicion or even reporting that this came with the blessing of the Obama administration, despite the fact that Obama at the time was speaking about the call of democracy and about how people anywhere rising up to demand their rights, the United States is going to come defend them or at least support them rhetorically or whatever.
Some nations may be able to turn a blind eye to atrocities in other countries. The United States of America is different. Wherever people long to be free, they will find a friend in the United States.
But there is this idea that that this crackdown actually may have come with the blessing of Obama in exchange for their broader political diplomatic support for his venture into Libya. I was just wondering if you could say more about that and also just the broader U.S. role in supporting the Bahraini monarchy during the crackdown.
Yes, so there's been some good reporting on this where there was a quid pro quo between the Saudi monarchy under King Abdullah at the time and Obama, because Obama at the time wanted to intervene in Libya. And the Saudis were not friends of Gaddafi, but the Obama administration felt that they needed the Saudis to not only be on board, but to like publicly endorse intervention in Libya, because the Saudis could bring the Arab League along to have sort of a mass approval of Obama's intervention in Libya. The Saudis were smart enough that even though they didn't care for Gaddafi and his government, they were able to wring out of Obama sort of tacit approval for them to cross the bridge and crack down on Bahrain, because the Obama administration felt that Libya was a far bigger prize and that it was worth throwing Bahrain under the bus. And to the extent that they even cared, I mean, for the Americans and for the West, broadly speaking, the Bahraini monarchy is far more suitable for their needs than a possible alternative, republic or sovereign government, really, because the Bahraini monarchy basically rolls over and does whatever the Americans and the Brits and now the Israelis want, really. As you guys know, Bahrain is one of the Abraham Accord signatories too. And that quid pro quo, the Obama administration never advertised it, obviously, but that's what drove Saudi to approve the bombing in Libya in exchange for going free reign in Bahrain. And at the time, I remember a lot of people, there was a lot of faith in the Obama administration, even in the Gulf. It was very strange, remembering this belief that this government in particular, the Americans in general, but this government in particular, would be able to pressure governments to give us our freedoms or whatever. And looking back, it's so depressing how cynical that the Obama administration was. More than the outright evil of the Trump administration or the Biden administration. By now we're all well aware of that. But there was a real moment of belief or hope in the Obama administration from a cross section of society that they would do something and pressure the Khalifas, and they didn't. That was very depressing.
Do you think that has lasting impact into how the United States is perceived, not just through the lens of Trump and his kind of wanton aggression, but also the promise or prospect of a more beneficent American power?
Yeah, I mean, the blindfolds have been ripped off from almost everyone at this point. The disdain that people hold towards America, even people who are ostensibly sectarian and anti-Shia and pro-monarchy, don't care for the Americans. Even people like my family, who many of them are very pro-American and were very pro-American and are still very pro-monarchy and very pro-current government, their past pro-Americanism is dead. They hate America and Israel. I mean, they hate Iran as much, but their disdain for America is a result of a lot of the what they see as entitled behavior and cynicism and betrayal.
I'm glad you brought up the Abraham Accords, because I do want to dig into how that was perceived inside of Bahrain. Because when those accords happened, I mean, obviously the UAE's normalization with Israel was touted as the big kahuna of that process. That was supposed to be the factor that stopped the plan to annex the Jordan Valley. But Bahrain, as you said, was the second state of that deal to normalize. They went along with it just as much as Abu Dhabi did. But the UAE can keep the lid down on opposition normalization because 90% of its population are not citizens. They're not even born in the Emirates. They're primarily guest workers from the Indian subcontinent, or they're from the Philippines, or they're migrants from Egypt and other Arab countries. I know that Bahrain has a very large South Asian guest worker population, but what kind of opposition to this deal was able to take place in Bahrain that could not have taken place in the UAE, even as you said, the opposition has had its back broken, essentially?
Well, there's two types of opposition to the Abraham Accords. There's the disjointed protests that happen in villages, predominantly Shia villages. And those are, marches primarily of youth, but also of the village's population, women and elders and so forth. And those are usually constrained within the villages by the police, and they end up sometimes in clashes and arrests, and people go in and out of jail. And then there's a more formal opposition to the Abraham Accords, organized around what is called the Bahraini Society Against the Normalization of the Zionist Enemy. The naming is a bit difficult to pronounce, but the short is BSAZ, B-S-A-Z, Bahraini Society Against Zionism. And that's a sort of local sort of NGO type organization that organizes organizes speeches and rallies, and they get a couple of hundred people out every Friday. Not recently, though, but since 2003 in particular, October 7th, they would do weekly rallies and stuff. And those are heavily monitored. I've been to a couple of those when I was last back. Those are like sort of very controlled. The cops are all around. They go from point A to point B. The speeches are monitored, and they're allowed only insofar as a release valve. And even then, a lot of people who otherwise sympathize with them won't come out because they're afraid of being seen at those rallies. So the numbers are very low. That said, most people are anti-normalization. It's just the post-2011 fear is so endemic in Bahraini society at this point that what I mentioned before, the mid-2000s era of some sort of robust politics, it not only has it died, it's shifted into every aspect of Bahraini life where people just don't talk about stuff anymore. No one knows who to trust. People go to jail for, like I said, posts, saying the wrong thing. And it's not just going to jail. You could lose your job. Your kids could lose educational opportunities. The cost imposed by the Bahraini government on opposition as such is high enough for most people, and the lack of organized opposition as an alternative has made it such that most people have calculated that it's better to just shut up and keep going with whatever it is, you know?
So, I mean, one aspect of normalization that I'm particularly interested in is how it relates to the kind of competing spheres of influence between Saudi and the Emirates. Earlier, when we were talking, you pinpointed 2020 as maybe the start of the shift when Bahrain is leaving the Saudi sphere of influence and kind of aligning more with the Emiratis. And I could see joining the Abraham Accords, which is very much an Emirati-led project, as a marker of that. But I'm curious if you also see it as something that happened with Saudi's blessing, that was a kind of like soft launch of Saudi's own normalization project to see how it played out, or to kind of like test run repressing domestic opposition to this in Bahrain. I don't know if this is like a totally bogus idea, but I'm just curious because like at that time in 2020, the Saudi UAE tensions weren't so out in the open. And so these dual tracks of normalization could both happen. And Saudi just, of course, has a lot more to contend with, right? As the seat of global Islam and its geopolitical importance. But, you know, Saudi also has minority populations that it needs to think about in terms of management and to kind of keep a lid on dissent. So, yeah, I'm just curious kind of what you make of that.
No, I mean, first of all, you're right. A decision that big for Bahrain does not go through without at least tacit Saudi approval, right? At the end of the day, we are more or less an appendage of Saudi in terms of our reliance on the shared oil field. They're a much bigger neighbor, and something that big when it comes to foreign policy would require Saudi approval, even if it's not publicized. And at that point, you are right. One of the big justifications that Sinwar, I believe, said about October 7th was to halt the spread of normalization, in particular, what was then seen as an impending normalization between Saudi and Israel. So like there was that sentiment within Saudi of they're going to be next, right? They're the big fish. And to that extent, Bahrain was a trial run. To the extent that they're measuring opposition, I think the thing with Saudi that we have to notice as well, you are right, there is a lot of minority population, the Shia in the eastern provinces and along the border with Yemen, certain tribes in the north. But the big threat that Saudi has always been terrified of has always been internal threats of a coup or some faction of the military branching off. And that's the legacy of 1979 and the trauma of the Grand Mosque seizure, because the Grand Mosque seizure came from disaffected National Guardsmen, right? So for Saudi, it's always been balancing the different security organs against one another, but also making sure that like none of them get too upset that they might launch a coup, right? The Bahraini trial run was interesting because there was some disapproval of the Abraham Accords, not just from the masses and the public, but also from within the palace and the military. But that was quickly tamped down upon. And there were internal shifts of power that made the Abraham Accords possible, namely the death of the old prime minister and his faction of hardliners being sort of sidelined. But the disapproval there, the fear there is that there would be enough disapproval, that there would be enough support within the military for such a coup. That didn't happen with Bahrain, which has made Saudi optimistic up until October 7th, obviously. But the ability to repress mass protests in Bahrain, I don't think that would translate to Saudi because Bahrain has always been better able to repress its people than Saudi has, because Saudi is much bigger and its population is much bigger.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I actually want to get into some of the history of that repression, kind of as promised. You mentioned the history of leftist organizing in Bahrain. And you mentioned in the piece that you wrote that these movements were very popular and widespread and actually led to formal independence from Britain in 1971. This then led to a new constitution in 1973 and parliamentary elections where leftists gained a significant number of seats. But then the newly crowned Isa bin Salman al Khalifa introduced the state security law, which then the leftists and the Islamists, interestingly, joined together to block. And then, as you write, Al Khalifa effectively overrode this just by tearing up the constitution and ruling by force, including through the heavy repression of the left. So I'm curious, you mentioned that there's active leftist organizing through the 90s and the 2000s. Can you talk about maybe the legacy of that moment, that repressive moment in the 70s, and then expound a bit on how leftist and Islamist currents in the country have interacted with one another in the wake of that?
I mean, the shared interest between leftists and Islamists has always been trying to build and uphold a parliamentary democracy, right? And the leftists in Bahrain, interestingly, by the way, a lot of them were veterans of the Dhofar War, the Dhofar uprising in Oman. A lot of Bahrainis went and volunteered with the leftist Omanis in Dhofar and then came back and brought those ideas back with them. But to your point about the 73 and the constitution, that was a moment, that was the sort of watershed moment in which whatever opportunity for some political arena in Bahrain was completely foreclosed. And that security law was, by the way, designed by one certain Ian Henderson. He crushed the Mau Mau in Kenya, and then the British Empire shifted him to Bahrain. So these characters always come back around, As the head of our General Intelligence Director, the National Security Organ in Bahrain, he advised the writing of this law, and it was this sort of very broad-based law that allowed detention for a long period of time without charges, and it was meant for the king to use as he pleased to crush opposition. Now, to your point about the Islamists and the leftists were very strong back then. You had a sort of spectrum from outright Maoists to social democrats, and you also had Islamists, Shia Islamists, and all of them united because they saw the security law for what it was, which was a threat to political organizing and electoralism in the country, and they organized parliament against it. But the limits of that organization was seen when Isa basically said, fuck off, and we're not going to have a parliament. And that's when the mass arrests started and deportations, exile, long sentences. Torture was widespread, by the way. They would torture anyone they got their hands on. And this shift led to a sort of pushing both leftists and Islamists underground, which led to a lot of violence in the 80s and 90s, in particular, the 90s Intifada, which lasted until the king, or the emir at the time, died and the current king took power. But that alliance between leftists and Islamists in Bahrain comes from that mutual understanding that the government needs to have some space for electoralism for those parties to contend. Now, in the 90s and 2000s, because of the reforms, the current king's reforms, a lot of parties moderated, right? The militancy of the 80s and 90s was reduced, and out of it came formal political parties that would contend no longer in the underground, but in formal electoralism. Unfortunately, those parties were quickly silenced through gerrymandering and outright vote bribing and so on and so forth. But there was a period in the 2000s where both the left and the Islamists, more so the Islamists in the 2000s, the left pretty much died in the 80s. The Islamists took over from the 90s into the 2000s, and there was a real sort of force of opposition. And that ended with 2011, but that alliance still to a certain degree was shown in 2011 when both the leftists and the Islamists were hosting unity rallies, and they would negotiate common demands, right? What is this protest for? It's for reform, it's for electoralism. And there was a unity of front essentially within Bahrain.
I want to ask a follow-up question, but somebody's playing Santana outside my window really loudly. Give it a moment. God, this is a great Rob Thomas song, though. I need to listen.
Smooth?
Yeah. I mean, I don't mind it, but we're recording something right now. I think he's stuck at the traffic light. No, he's parked. And he's playing this fucking song.
It's a vibe vigilante. Sometimes that happens. The vibe vigilante shows up.
I'm just going to say the question, but if you could just try to do your best. So, Bahrain is granted independence from the British in 71, but Iran has been laying claim to Bahrain throughout the British occupation of it. And then the Shah accedes to this independence. And I'm curious how Bahrain responds to the revolution initially in 79 when the Islamists come to power. Like, how does the country respond? How does the government respond? And is there you talk about the Islamists coming in the 90s, but was there some sort of pro-Iran movement happening in Bahrain in that very early period in the 1980s?
There was some faction of the Islamists that were sympathetic with Iran. And again, to be clear, not to be annexed by Iran, but to import the model of the Wilayat al-Faqih to Bahrain. There is sympathy there with some people. I'm not going to say that no one believes in that, right? But what 79 did was basically freak the fuck out of the Khalifas, because if anything, the Shah was belligerent, but the Shah was acceded to Bahrain sovereignty through negotiation with the British, right? There was a referendum, a UN referendum I shouldn't say a referendum, it was basically like the UN sent a representative to Bahrain to like gauge the interest of whether they wanted to be independent or join Iran. Everyone obviously said independence. They went back to the UN and said they wanted to be independent, and the Shah sort of acceded to the British demands as part of a broader negotiation on the region. Once 79 happened, the idea of a Wilayat al-Faqih happening in Bahrain terrified the Khalifas, and the repression, they dialed things a lot higher. And this was all the Gulf, by the way, because initially Khomeini was very much articulated a vision of Wilayat al-Faqih that's supposed to spread. He was an internationalist in that sense. His belief was that the revolution should spread outside of Iran into the rest of the region. And that was one of the fears of the Gulf, which is why the Gulf supported Saddam during the Iran-Iraq war. And there was no blowback whatsoever from that in Kuwait. Thank you very much. But, sorry, kidding there. It's just one of the funnier aspects of that. It's just, the Bahrainis also supported Saddam. All the Gulf monarchs supported Saddam during that war. But for the Bahrainis in particular, the fear was that it was a fear that is not entirely unfounded, but it was misshapen, because to the extent that the Islamists wanted some sovereignty, there was never any fear of annexation. Like they still wanted Bahrain to be independent, but the way the monarchy framed it was that they wanted to be part of Iran proper. They would just sell the country to Iran and then establish Iranians' control of Bahrain. Oh, and also they'll do genocide on the Sunnis. Some of the monarchy likes saying that. And that fear, to this day, you mentioned early in the episode the arrest of the 41 clerics in Bahrain and their accusation of being sympathetic to Iran. Now, post the current war, they're treating Wilayat al-Faqih as ipso facto a terrorist ideology. Like just any belief in Wilayat al-Faqih is seen as supporting terrorism in of itself. Regardless of you could be anti-Iran but supporting Wilayat al-Faqih in Bahrain, and for them, that's still terrorism, which for a lot of Shia in Bahrain, you might as well say a Catholic supporting the Pope is terrorism. It's weaponized, obviously, but it's weaponized so broadly that it could mean anything and everything to anyone and everyone at any given point.
Yeah. I wanted to follow up about this, particularly about how sectarianism, or perhaps more accurately, the boogeyman of sectarianism is leveraged in Bahrain, because it seems like, you've mentioned that the Al Khalifa ruling family has been in power for quite a while.
Yes,
right?
Yes, since 1871, maybe.
Yeah. And it seems that they have held power in part through leveraging a kind of Shia phobia, or more broadly, these sectarian fears as a form of divide and rule, in part by casting any kind of domestic dissent as Shia influence from Iran, as opposed to cross-sectarian domestic oppositional movements. But as you write in your piece, and this is perhaps surprising to people who may have internalized some of this narrative, there's actually a decent amount of organic support for Iran's war effort, even among the Sunni population. So I guess my question is, how effective has the monarchy been in driving these sectarian divisions, and is the war changing that at all?
The war is complicated because a lot of people still, to the extent that they're sympathetic with Iran, they're sympathetic with Iran's strikes on the US assets, but they reserve some criticism for the US or for the Iranian strikes on Bahraini civil infrastructure. The sympathy for Iran is very much insofar as it's defending itself and that, it has a right to defend itself, and that the US and Israel have dragged the entire region into war without any strategic vision whatsoever. I mean, notwithstanding a certain faction of the loyalist monarchists who are very pro-war against Iran, and those minds will never change. Their sectarianism drives their worldview. A lot of Sunnis, middle-class Sunnis, both Khudmunis, which are of Iranian descent, as well as Arabs, to the extent that they're sympathetic to Iran, they're sympathetic to Iran's struggles against America because they hate America and Israel more. Again, the Iranian strikes on Bahraini civil infrastructure has soured that note a little bit, but that varies from person to person. And it should also be noted that a lot of strikes on Iran came from Bahraini soil. Like America was organizing strikes from Bahraini soil, which is why when Iran struck a Bahraini desalination plant, that was in response to the strike on the Bushehr desalination plant in Iran coming from the Bahrain base. Now, to answer your question about the broad cross-sectarian coalition of people who would otherwise be sympathetic to Iran, I don't think that sympathy extends to formal mass opposition to the war publicly. People are frustrated and they're disappointed and they're exhausted, but I think the lack of any infrastructure for the opposition, as well as what the Bahraini government has been doing, which is the combination of mass arresting people for showing sympathy with Iran and then forcing people to sign pledges of allegiance to the king, has had the effect of spreading widespread enough fear that many people, even if they are sympathetic, are keeping quiet. There's no real way to translate the sentiments of people, Sunni or Shia, into something resembling mass mobilization. Now, that could change at any minute, obviously, but my view is that there's really not a lot of avenues for that to change.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the lack of the ability for the Shia opposition to maybe affect a long-term future, but I guess if you're trying to look through a cloudy crystal ball, if the war with Iran intensifies, if more Gulf states become militarily involved, there were already covert strikes by the UAE and Saudi Arabia against Iran during the war and after the ceasefire, apparently. I remember seeing those videos of the initial days of the strikes when Bahrainis are going to the Fifth Fleet headquarters and cheering and screaming. And Dylan had sent me some mobilization that had happened, I think, just the other night, if I'm correct.
Yeah, I mean, again, very limited. As much as it is a mobilization, it's also a mobilization against the arrest of the clerics and like the local domestic grievances, which are obviously tied to the war, but the most recent mobilizations are against the deportation of the families and the denaturalizations and so forth.
I mean, my question would be, I'm hesitating to ask is, but if the spine of the opposition has been broken, but there seems to be all these contradictions coming to a head, then what is the way out for opposition to the monarchy? Is there a way out, or do external forces have to bring that kind of change to the fore, whatever those might be?
That is a very, very, very difficult question. I mean, it's interesting because the fate of Bahrain is intimately intertwined with Saudi and the UAE and Iran and the region at large in a way where there simply isn't any mechanism by which the opposition can impose costs on the Bahraini government that the Bahraini government can't then retaliate to. The threshold for forcing the Bahraini government to concede is so high that personally, that my view, and again, it's very difficult to answer this question, but I will try. My view is that change in Bahrain is highly dependent, almost I would say entirely dependent on change in Saudi and the region at large. As long as the Saudi monarchy exists in its current format, and as long as the other regional powers exist in their current format, I don't think change in Bahrain could happen, because the Bahraini government has shown no qualms in shooting people and detaining people and torturing people, right? And that's the cost they're willing to impose right now, and that's the cost they've been willing to impose since 2011. And there has been no limits from their guarantors, their protectors, right? The Americans are okay with it. The Saudis are okay with it. So in that environment, in that climate, short of a civil war, which You could argue maybe that's an alternative, but even the opposition themselves are not willing to do a civil war. During 2011, the formal opposition said that they were not willing to take up arms because they wanted a peaceful revolution or a peaceful uprising. And to a certain extent, their views have been vindicated because the alternative would have been Syria or Libya or Yemen, right? And no one in the formal opposition was willing to do that. Forget whether they were able to get guns or not, just the willingness wasn't there. So to that extent, I don't see any way in which Bahrain changes without Saudi first changing. And it kind of reminds me of where I am right now, where I'm in Canada, and there's a limit to which Canada can change without first America changing. It's a very small country next to a big country is always tied to that big country's political currents, whatever they may be. And with Saudi, I've said this before to people, and it's a very, very bleak thing, but I genuinely believe that Saudi would rather sink the island to the bottom of the sea than let an unfriendly government or even a moderately oppositional government take power in Bahrain. Like, they would turn to Atlantis before they let anything short of a client control the country. Even when Bahrain is moving out of its orbit towards the UAE, whatever intra-regional domestic conflicts occur between Saudi and other regional countries, at the end of the day, as Bahrain must be answerable to Riyadh.
Aamer, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Yeah, Aamer, thank you so much. This was really enlightening. I just want to make space if there's anything that you want to promote or uplift of your own work or any campaigns or causes or anything.
Just check out North-South Notes. Vince is a great guy, and they're doing great work over there. It's a great publication. You can find me on Twitter at Ibn Kulthum, and thank you for having me.